The Passion of the Christ is a 2004 film directed by Mel Gibson. In Christianity, the Passion refers to the final period in the life of Jesus Christ. The film is an amalgamation of the 4 canonical Gospels in the New Testament of the Holy Bible, as well as other sources that I will get into later. The Passion of the Christ is not a film about the life of Jesus of Nazareth. It is only about his death. A grim, grotesque trudge through a few chapters of the trial and crucifixion that exaggerate, distort, or in some cases falsify the Gospels. In the beginning of the film, Jesus prays in the Garden of Gethsemane, which is certainly in the Bible. There, he is tempted by an androgynous Satan and stomps on a snake, which is absolutely not in the Bible. The whole movie is like this. Bear in mind, there is nothing inherently wrong with adding some color or a new spin on an old story, but Mel Gibson's vision is not simply making the death of Jesus Christ more engaging to a movie theater audience. No, his vision is that of needless violence, guilt, fear, and bigotry. Many of the accusations of antisemitism in the film are related to the expanded role of the Jewish leaders. In the Gospels, following the arrest of Jesus, they appear only briefly. In the film, they are everywhere. The film also absolves Pontius Pilate of any wrongdoing. We also get a slow-motion shot of Judas accepting the silver for his betrayal, spilling out and showing a Jewish man quite literally money-grubbing on the floor. That and the fact that the film, though not subtitled, shouts the infamous blood curse on the Jewish people, blaming and condemning them for a perceived role in the death of Jesus Christ. At the urging of critics, Mel Gibson did remove the subtitle, but kept the line itself in the film. In other words, it's still there, you just have to look. Matthew 27:25 decrees, "His blood shall be upon us and our children." It's a verse in the Bible that has been used to justify antisemitism and the eradication of the Jewish people. Its inclusion is both unnecessary for a film about Jesus, it is conspicuously absent in 3 of the 4 canonical Gospels, but it is also incredibly dangerous. Words matter, as the recent growth in white supremacy and antisemitism in my country and its politics are any indication. The author of the Gospel of Matthew's account of the trial of Jesus was influenced by the politics of his day, but we will get into that later. Those who defend the anti-Semitism in The Passion of the Christ refer to it simply being biblically accurate. This argument has a few holes. First, the Gospels contradict one another in a number of ways, including but not limited to the story depicted in this film. It is not possible to have an entirely biblically accurate film adaptation of the Gospels unless one structures it like Rashomon. Another problem is that the Jewish leaders are given a significantly larger role in the film than in the actual Gospels. The scenes in which Jesus is brought to be questioned by Caiaphas, the high priest, start a little after the 16-minute mark in the film. We deviate from Jesus' questioning here and there with some flashbacks, but even so, we stay on this until about 32 minutes into the film. By contrast, in the Gospel of Luke, for example, the Jewish elders question Jesus in chapter 22 only through verses 66 through 71. It can be read in about 30 seconds. In the film, Jesus is brutalized by the Jewish authorities, but the Gospel of Luke says nothing of this. The Gospel of John says he was struck, but only once. The Gospels of Matthew and Mark say more struck him, but the film exaggerates not only the role of the Jews, but the brutality of the Jews. They make a few more appearances that are not in the Gospels as well, and say things that are not canonical either. So claiming that the Passion of the Christ is simply following the words of the Holy Bible is provably false. Furthermore, the Passion of the Christ takes a lot of liberties with the source material even beyond the Jewish leaders, including a humanizing characterization of Pontius Pilate, which is neither biblically nor historically accurate. The film may draw inspiration from 19th century German mystic and nun Anne Catherine Emmerich, author of The Dolorous Passion of Our Lord Jesus Christ. This is the source of the scene in the film in which Jews, not the Romans as suggested in the Bible, make Jesus' cross. This is done in front of him in the court of the Jewish high priest of all places. This is not in the Bible, and it's just another example of exaggerating the Jewish role. Herod Antipas is portrayed as an effeminate stereotype, which is strange considering Herod's lust for women is one of his defining features in the New Testament. I honestly don't know if this is Mel Gibson's documented homophobia taking form, or just some kind of random weirdness in this already troubling film. This interpretation works in Jesus Christ Superstar, but in this film, meant to be taken seriously, he comes across as a coded gay villain. The point is not that being inaccurate in and of itself is a problem. The Last Temptation of Christ is a great film and diverges even more wildly from the source material. The point is that accuracy cannot be used as a defense of the film's antisemitism, not when the film is deeply inaccurate from start to finish. Tracing the roots of antisemitism is incredibly complicated, but the roots of antisemitism exclusively among Christianity is much clearer. Let's go back to the aforementioned blood curse from the Gospel according to Matthew. The historicity of Matthew 27 is dubious for many reasons, but first some history. The four Gospels were not written in Aramaic, the language of Jesus both in the film and in the region where he lived. Instead, they were written in Greek, which was the language of scholarship during the years of the composition of the New Testament, generally abbreviating Christ's name with the two Greek letters iota sigma. The Gospels are widely believed to be written more than a generation after the events ascribed in them, in cities in the Roman Empire like Antioch, Ephesus, and even Rome itself. The Gospels are far removed from the events they allegedly describe. The historical Jesus was a Jew, deeply faithful to both the law of Moses and the teachings of the prophets. He lived in Galilee, where Jewish patriotism was rather intense due to being a minority within the Roman Empire. Like many religious Jews, he expected the imminent coming of the Messianic era in the world to come, called the Olam Haba, particularly due to the Jews in the region being under the administration of the Romans. After Jesus' death, Jews competed over whether or not Jesus was the Messiah, or Mashiach. Considering Jesus did not meet the criteria for the Jewish Messiah as described in the books of Jeremiah and Isaiah, that being a political and military leader descended from King David, the legitimacy of his claim was obviously deeply contentious. Mistrust of Jews was so widespread in the aftermath of a Jewish revolt against Rome that the young Christian churches attempted to distance themselves from their roots. This hostility was written into the Gospels. They told the story of Jesus Christ in such a way that it appeared as if his real enemies were not the Romans who put him to death, but rather the Jews, meaning the Pharisees, priests, and Jewish people in general. The Gospel of Mark was likely the first one written, though some scholars disagree with this. It was probably written during or after the First Jewish-Roman War, when anti-Jewish resentment was strong in the capital. Critical scholars generally argue that the Gospel accounts place the blame on the Jews and not on Rome due to the author's goal of making peace with the Roman Empire and vilifying the Jews. In the Gospel of Mark, Jesus is persecuted by the Pharisees and priests of Judaism. The author of the Gospel of Mark portrayed Pontius Pilate as largely innocent of Jesus' death. In his account, even a Roman centurion claims, "Truly this man was the Son of God." The notion that Jewish leaders had arrested Jesus and forced the Romans into crucifying him has several historical and biblical contradictions. First, Pontius Pilate was a prefect, a kind of governor. He was not so easily forced to do anything, especially not by a religious minority with no real authority over him. Second, the Jewish leaders asking Pilate to execute Jesus because, as the Gospel of John and Mel Gibson's film claim, the Jews could not execute Jesus without Pilate, makes very little sense. The Jewish high priest probably had the authority, either through legal means or by means of skirting the law, to execute by stoning. Jesus himself defended Mary Magdalene from a stoning. There is even a scene in the film showing this. There is also the stoning of St. Stephen in the Acts of the Apostles, and the stoning of St. James the Just in the Antiquities of the Jews, written by Flavius Josephus. In other words, the idea that Jewish authorities would even require Pontius Pilate to execute Jesus contradicts both historical records and other parts of the Bible, which many scholars believe is evidence of it being politically convenient at the time to blame the Jews entirely and completely absolve the Roman Empire of any guilt. Theologians like Ulrich Lutz describe the blood curse in the book of Matthew as redactional fiction invented by the author. Because of this, antisemitism became part of church teaching. 4th century Bishop of Antioch, John Chrysostom, preached fiery sermons against the Jews. He was canonized a saint. In the Middle Ages in Europe, the death of Jesus was enacted annually in passion plays, using the Gospels as source material, which leads us to this film, an adaptation not only of Mel Gibson's version of the Gospels, but also a continuation of antisemitism from the early church and Middle Ages. Gibson's vision is not only outdated, it is ancient. Even if one takes the worldview of at least trying to separate the art from the artist, it's difficult when Gibson's well-known antisemitism is not only a part of himself, the artist, but his film, the art. Christianity has taken steps to soothe the centuries-old wounds between their faith and Judaism. In the early 1960s, the Catholic Church's Vatican II denounced antisemitism and stated that Jews of the past and today bear no responsibility for the death of Jesus Christ. I suppose Gibson, a devout Catholic, missed the memo. Even outside of the realm of the dubious blood curse, antisemitism within Christianity has never made much sense. Christ was a Jew himself, as were innumerable other important figures in the Bible. Bigotry, by definition, is not logical, but antisemitism among Christians is an even more bizarre, irreconcilable contradiction. Beyond the most obvious manner in which it is an offensive, duplicitous film, The Passion of the Christ does not represent the life of Jesus particularly well. Within the Christian faith, the Passion refers to everything from the arrival of Jesus in Jerusalem to his death. Gibson's film, allegedly made in the traditions of centuries-old Passion plays, ignores everything in the beginning of what is considered to be the Passion. The film begins in the Garden of Gethsemane, immediately before the capture of Jesus. Everything that came before it is relegated to brief flashbacks, sometimes without dialogue, and usually only lasting a few seconds. The director saw a few words in the Bible about someone being condemned to crucifixion, being flogged first, and he ran with it to create an unbearably long torture scene. I can't even show all of it because it's too gross for this show. There is no reason for the scene to be so long, and I'm not even showing the most brutal aspects of it in this video. The scourging and crucifixion were undoubtedly violent, obviously, but does Mel Gibson honor the sacrifice of Jesus Christ, or inflate the gospel account to a disgusting degree? Matthew, Mark, and John devote only one verse to the scourging of Jesus. Luke does not even mention it. Carrying the cross to Golgotha occupies only 6 verses in Luke, and only 1 in Matthew, Mark, and John. In the film, it takes forever. It is needlessly barbaric. Once again, I must be clear that the issue is not that the film is inaccurate. Rather, it is what these inaccuracies are propagating. It is why these inaccuracies exist. We have to ask ourselves, why is this movie this way? What is the movie's purpose? What was the point of showing extensive scenes of Jesus Christ in the most graphic and disgusting way possible? Some have pointed out that these scenes flesh out an otherwise short story into a feature-length film. But even if one removes a great deal of the violence, it would still be an appropriate feature length of about 90 minutes instead of 126. So it can't be that. Is Gibson ignorant about the contents of the Bible? Probably not, at least not to such a stunning degree. Did he assume audiences just want to see lots of blood and he has no other intention beyond that? Again, probably not, based on his own beliefs. The most overt point of the film, in showing gratuitous amounts of blood, is that of guilt. The Passion of the Christ is an ugly film, but it is also a film that clearly wishes to guilt its audience into renewing their faith or even converting. It's not exactly subtle. The film presents a grotesque and biblically inaccurate account of the final hours of Jesus Christ, and says, "See, look what he did for you. Look what you did to him." This is not the way to engage people in faith. Guilt is certainly an effective motivator, but what are you motivating besides fear and shame? This is not a story about Jesus and his love. It is about Jesus and his barbaric flogging. It is about Jesus and those who have twisted his name to spread intolerance. Thanks for watching the latest episode of Renegade Cut, everyone. If you want to support the show, you can click the orange link to my Patreon. That's how all of this happens. If you want to subscribe and never miss an episode, click on the red link. If you want to watch more, there are some recommended videos below. I'll see you next week for another episode.